Blood and Iron by Zehntner. TTS by Mr.light. Chapter 10. A day-long awaited life in the academy was tough, but fair. It was no walk in the park, but because Bruno already had experience in this regard from his past life, he was more than capable of fulfilling what was required of him. In fact, he excelled where others had lagged behind. Even the drill instructors could not help but express surprise at Bruno's ability to complete the tasks required of him. Despite having no formal military training, the boy could march, salute, run, and shoot with the best of them. On top of this, Bruno performed with the highest marks in all subjects, whether it was strategy, tactics, mathematics, science, history etc. He had demonstrated a clear mastery of all. In addition to this, Bruno appeared to be quite innovative and forward-thinking when it came to the subject of grand strategy, gaining praise from all of his instructors for his revolutionary use of tactics within war games. In the 3 years that Bruno spent in the academy, he had grown close to 2 of his fellow cadets, Heinrich Koch, and surprisingly the arrogant young nobleman Erich von Humboldt. As Bruno had anticipated, Erich had a hell of a first week at the academy. Growing up as a pampered nobleman, Erich was in no shape to perform the physical tasks required of them as army cadets, but through sheer perseverance, he had survived, and somehow managed not to get cut from the roster. As a result, he became much more humble and realistic about his own limitations, going so far as to begin approaching those who excelled in various fields searching for their guidance. This was an admirable quality which attracted Bruno's attention. Erich would ultimately improve his performance over the first semester, to the point where Bruno had no problem including him into his study group, as the man had actually turned out to be a hidden talent he could make use of in the future. Today was the day before Bruno's wedding day. Heidi had just turned 18 a few weeks prior, whereas Bruno was 20 years old at this very moment. He would be granted a day of leave from the academy to attend his wedding, but that would only happen tomorrow. For today, he was still at the academy, currently discussing the ongoing geopolitical situation among his 2 friends, Heinrich and Erich. The Kaiser challenges the British Navy on the seas. This naval arms race is destined to cause conflict between our 2 great nations, and if handled poorly, will result in a war on a scale which will cost the lives of tens of millions of men on both sides. But it may very well be a decade and a half before such a war breaks out. My immediate concern is the outbreak of war within King China. As we speak, the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, or the Boxer movement, as we more commonly refer to them as, have gained considerable size and strength. The Boxers are an anti-imperialist and xenophobic movement which seeks to expel all non-Chinese from the nation by force. They have already attacked our missionaries and merchants. At their current rate of aggression, it is only a matter of time before they grow bolder. Their slogan is quite literally "Kill the foreigners, slaughter the followers of the foreign devils." If they are allowed to continue to gain power and the Qing dynasty chooses to support them even further, then I fear the end result will be military intervention. I give it a year at most before such a thing occurs if things continue to progress like this. Now, the Chinese may be a few decades behind us in terms of military technology, but they have made great strides towards modernization these past few years. Because of this, they should not be underestimated under any circumstances. Such a thing could lead to a humiliating defeat. It is because of this I intend to volunteer for the East Asian Expeditionary Corps the moment I graduate from this academy, which should be just in time to get comfortable with my new unit before we deploy to northern China to put down the Boxer rebellion. Matters in China were far away on the eastern side of the world. Few cadets cared to actually bother themselves with learning of such matters, but Bruno would have a thorough conversation with his fellow cadets about the subject, educating them on the importance the region had towards the future. By the end of the discussion, both Heinrich and Erich seemed eager to take part in the war alongside Bruno, with Heinrich being the first to voice his agreement to volunteer for the East Asian Expeditionary Corps as well. "Fuck it, why the hell not?" What's the point of joining the army if you don't actually get to see battle? Besides, I hear China is an ancient and mystical place, full of many beautiful women. It would be a shame not to visit at least once in my life." Eric nodded his head in agreement with this statement. With their performance in the academy, they would likely be given priority to wherever they desired to serve, and China sounded like it would be a good place to gain some proper combat experience, especially if Bruno was so confident that war was about to erupt in the region. As for Bruno, he smirked before responding to Heinrich's comment about beautiful Chinese women. "I'll leave the local ladies to you two. I'm a married man as of tomorrow, and I don't intend to take a mistress." Heinrich immediately patted Bruno's back and commented on his situation as if it was something undesirable. "That is the one thing I do not envy about you nobles. Imagine getting married upon reaching adulthood. Where is your opportunity to live and have fun?" Bruno however shook his head. He had experienced quite a bit of fun in his youth during his past life, but his greatest regret as he got older was never getting married or having any children. He would not ruin such a valuable opportunity given to him in this life by entertaining in such hedonism. Because of this, he shook his head and sighed, sounding like an old man as he lectured Heinrich on his words. "You will understand when you're older." Both Heinrich and Derek broke out into laughter when they heard this, mocking Bruno for his words. "What do you mean when we're older? You're the youngest cadet in our year. Mr.light graduated from high school a year earlier than everyone else." With that, Bruno would continue to have fun with his friends before going back to his studies for the day. He would have a long and peaceful sleep that night, because the next day he would be getting married. Bruno was up bright and early the next morning. He was transported to his family's estate where he would prepare for the wedding, which was being held later that day at a church in Berlin. As a Prussian, his family were Protestants, not that Bruno cared for religion at all. Still, the entire family had gathered, and not just his father, mother, and siblings, but all of his uncles, aunts and cousins as well. In addition to this, Heidi's mother was present. As for her father, and half-siblings, none of them dared show up at a bastard's wedding. Heidi had never been legitimized, and thus, for them to show up to her wedding would be some kind of recognition that she was a von Bentham-Tecklenburg, which she was not. Because of this, the girl was walked down the aisle not by her father, but by Bruno's father, who had in many ways been more of a father to the girl in her youth than her own. Bruno stood at the altar, dressed in the most luxurious tailcoat tuxedo of the era, while Heidi walked down the aisle to the sound of the music, with a bouquet of white roses in her hands, wearing a Victorian-style wedding dress that was suitable for a princess. All the while her hair was one more tied up in an elegant bun. Even Bruno's breath was stolen away when she approached the altar, and the veil over her head was removed. Throughout the past 3 years at the military academy, he had seldom seen the girl, only on holidays. But whenever they did see one another, it was a warm and loving atmosphere. He had to admit, now that she was 18, and they were about to get married, that over the past 15 years of being childhood friends, he had fallen under the woman's spell. And because of this, Bruno simply smiled, and made a whisper towards his young bride while the Lutheran priest was going through the motions, preparing his long-winded speech before the vows could finally be said. "You look absolutely stunning. I am truly at a loss for words." Heidi smiled, and blushed, trying not to make it obvious that she was speaking to Bruno while the priest was continuing with the traditional wedding speech. She couldn't help but make a comment about Bruno's appearance, albeit far more light-hearted. "You don't look so bad yourself." Eventually, the part where the priest asked about the vows came, where the young couple both said the words "I do" before being granted to kiss one another, where Bruno approached his young bride and held her tightly in his arms, placing a wholesome kiss on her lips, and thus sealing their marriage as husband and wife from this day forward, until final days. The wedding reception was held in Bruno's family home. For the time being as a cadet, Bruno did not have his own home as he was living in the barracks. But that would change shortly after he graduated, or so he thought. But during the night of festivities, drinking, feasting, and plenty of gifts to the newly married couple. Bruno's father approached him and took him aside. He wanted to have a few words with the boy in private. The two of them entered the balcony of the family's estate, where the light of a full moon was high in the air. Bruno figured his father was going to say something about how proud he was, like he had done the day he entered the military academy. But instead, the man surprised him by tossing him a set of keys. Bruno's heightened reflexes caught the keys, where he stared at them with curiosity. That is until the old man finally spoke up and revealed what they unlocked. "Those are yours now. I recently purchased this old manor, not far from the nearest military base. It's a quaint little home, one that has been thoroughly renovated to make use of all the modern technology that the two of you have grown up with. You and Heidi can make it your home as you build your family together. Consider it my wedding gift to you, son." Bruno was surprised that his father had bought him an entire house, but only for a second. When he thought about it, he realized the cost of such a home was a drop in the hat compared to his family's wealth. They were quite wealthy, more than enough to afford such an expensive present as a wedding gift. But, still, Bruno had yet to reveal to his father his plans to go to war, and he was quick to do so as he felt guilty about owning a house he would not have the luxury to spend much time in. "Father, this is more than I could ever ask of you, but when I graduate I intend to volunteer to the East Asian Expeditionary Corps. I won't be home outside those few weeks of leave I am granted each year. At least not for the first 2 years of my service. After that, I'll request to transfer back to Berlin. Don't you think it would be cruel to ask Heidi to live in such a home by herself?" Bruno's father was naturally surprised by what his son had said, but he was not ignorant of the ongoings in China. He, too, was certain that Germany would be deploying troops to the region within a year's time. And because of this, he was quick to ask his son if he understood exactly what he was getting himself into. "Bruno, you are aware of what's going on in China right now, yes? Are you really going to go off to war so soon after graduating from the academy?" Bruno's father naturally knew about war and its horrors. He had earned an Iron Cross in the Franco-Prussian War. He had also fought in the Austro-Prussian War a mere 5 years prior, so he was more than experienced enough with battle to understand what Bruno himself was walking into. But Bruno's confidence was more than enough to quell the man's fears, as the young man was quick to announce that he was not so foolish as to underestimate the enemy. Contrary to popular belief, the enemy are not savages. They are quite advanced, and though victory is certain should the Reich go to war in China, let alone alongside the other great powers, we will still need capable officers if we wish to mitigate our losses. I am confident enough in my own ability to lead men into battle. And besides, my generation has yet to earn any honor or glory for our house on the battlefield. Wouldn't it be poetic that it was the youngest of us who first did so?" Bruno's father sighed heavily and shook his head. He looked up at the stars and thought to himself for a few moments before finally responding. "You're a man now, so you have a right to choose your own future. If you wish to go off to China and fight for our family and nation, then that is your right. But regardless, I still think it would be best if you and Heidi moved into the house. It's close enough to the nearest military base so that when you do finally transfer back home, you will be well within your rights to live there as an active duty officer. And the house is small enough that your wife will be able to take care of it by herself. Although if she does wish for servants, I can spare the expense. Now I have held you up enough. It's your wedding night, and I think it's time you and your bride spent some proper time alone together. After all, tomorrow you have to be back at the academy. So go, enjoy yourself while you can." Bruno smiled and nodded towards his father, stashing the key to his new manor away in his pocket, before running off to regroup with Heidi. They would continue to enjoy the festivities before retiring for the night together for the first time as husband and wife. A year came and went, from the time Bruno had his wedding night, until the day he graduated from the academy and officially entered service within the Imperial German Army as a commissioned officer. As the most exceptional cadet to graduate in his class, Bruno was immediately awarded the rank of first lieutenant, whereas the rest of his class graduated as second lieutenants. Bruno was immediately granted the position he requested, which was being assigned to the East Asian Expeditionary Corps, and was given 2 weeks of leave before shipping off to his new unit. After all, by now China was thoroughly embroiled in the early stages of the Boxer Rebellion, and it would be a matter of months before the 8-nation alliance was officially formed in response. When Bruno returned to his home, he was not surprised to find that Heidi was waiting for him. She appeared to have been notified in advance of his temporary leave and was quick to greet her husband at the door of the quiet and quaint manor. They had only seen each other over the holidays during the past year, despite being newlyweds. And as much as Bruno wanted to take her out to some place extravagant for a proper honeymoon, he was not able to do so because of his military obligations. Still, to see the young woman's loving smile as she welcomed him home was a sight for sore eyes indeed. Of course, her smile immediately vanished, and turned into concern when she saw Bruno's face, quickly approaching the man and grabbing hold of his chin, carefully examining his cheekbones on the right side of his face. "My God, what has happened to your face? Are you all right? Who did this to you?" Bruno grabbed hold of Heidi's hands with his own and lifted them off his face. He had a confident smile as he explained the blemish that was cut horizontally on his cheekbones. "Relax, Heidi, it's a simple fencing scar. I received it during a contest with a student from the Bavarian Military Academy. After my duel with Julius all those years ago, I was practically forced to join the Mensa team at the academy. And by the way, I won the match, so don't go pitying me as if I'm some kind of loser." The scar was neither hideous nor large. It was left by a glancing blow, and was quite small, no matter how noticeable it may be. Heidi, of course, pouted as she heard Bruno had gotten hurt taking up the sword again, and she lectured him on his reckless actions as a result. "You shouldn't be risking your health simply because they asked you to take up fencing on behalf of the academy. I'll go get some alcohol and I'll try to clean it up." Bruno wanted to tell the girl there was no point, as the wound was old, having suffered the blow several months ago. By now it was thoroughly scarred and there was nothing she could do about it. But she nevertheless ran off to fetch the first aid kit. In reality, the moment she turned the corner, she rested her back on the wall. Her face was thoroughly flush as she tried to calm her beating heart. Although she scolded her husband, Heidi thought that the scar he had received was rather dignified and actually enhanced his already handsome appearance. Before long, she returned to Bruno and carried on with her pointless attempt to disinfect the scar. After spending a lovely night together, eating a home-cooked meal prepared by Heidi, and then absconding off to the bedroom, Bruno pulled out a pack of cigarettes as he stepped out naked onto his bedroom's private balcony. He lit up a smoke and stared at the crescent moon above. There were a lot of thoughts on his mind, particularly because he had not actually told Heidi yet that he had volunteered to lead a platoon of soldiers in the most chaotic part of the world as of this moment, one that Germany, and the other great powers would no doubt be sending troops to in 2 months during the botched Seymour expedition. Today was June 20, 1900, and while Bruno lay with his wife in the safety and comfort of Berlin, the siege of the legations had already begun. At this very moment, the Boxer movement and the Qing dynasty were laying siege to the embassies of several foreign nations located in Peking, or what would later be known as Beijing. This, of course, included the German embassy. It was only a matter of time before the 8-nation alliance was formed. In the coming days, the great powers would march into Peking with the intent of relieving their besieged embassies, and restoring order to the region through military force. Unfortunately, unless history changed, there was no way for Bruno to participate in these battles, seeing as the Germans who fought in them were Marines from the Sea Battalion, whereas he was a newly commissioned officer in the German army. Despite this, there would still be plenty of opportunities to participate in the war effort. While his duties would primarily consist of acting as an occupying force, there were still remnants of the Boxer movement, which needed to be put down. It was with these thoughts in mind that Bruno finished his cigarette. All the while he felt the gentle hand of his wife touch his back, as she hugged him from behind, before asking him a question in a somber tone. "Is everything all right? You have been out here smoking for the past hour." Bruno could no longer hide the truth from his wife. Until now, he had been neglecting to tell the woman about his plans for the immediate future, partially because they had not been set in stone until his deployment orders were in hand, but also because he didn't want her to worry excessively. Now, however, the time had come to tell the truth. He turned around with a heavy sigh, after putting out his cigarette and leaving what remained of it in the ashtray. "I have been assigned to the East Asian Expeditionary Corps. In 2 weeks I'll be shipping off to China. I'm afraid we only have a few weeks together before I have to leave again." Heidi was mortified at hearing Bruno's words, and not for the reason that Bruno initially thought she would be. The young woman stumbled backwards, almost as if she had lost her footing. Naturally, Bruno quickly ran to the woman's side and carried her back to the bed, where he sat her down, while checking on her condition. "Heidi, are you all right? What's wrong?" It took Heidi a few seconds to process what Bruno had said, but when she did, she looked at him with eyes that were almost praying that she hadn't heard correctly, and asked him a question which he found to be strange. "You're being shipped off to China? But aren't tensions rising in that part of the world right now? You're not going to be in danger, are you?" The reason this question was shocking to Bruno was because international disputes occurring on the other side of the world weren't exactly information that was easily accessible to the public. This wasn't the 21st century where anything that was happening around the globe could be instantly looked up by billions of people the moment it occurred. Hell, it would easily be another 100 years before the internet was invented. Even telephones were a rarity nowadays, most commonly found in wealthy households, and were only capable of local connections at that, other than perhaps in the hands of government personnel. How Heidi possessed such information caused Bruno to pause and interrogate her about it. "Heidi, how do you know what is going on in China right now?" Heidi immediately panicked. She hadn't thought through the logical conclusion of her question, and immediately tried to come up with some proper response to satisfy her husband's inquiry. That is to say, I was in the market the other day and I heard some woman say that she was worried about her son who is stationed in Tsingtao. She said there was some kind of rebellion happening across the country. While this was feasible, especially if the woman was a family member of a soldier, it was still highly suspicious because of the way that Heidi was acting. But Bruno ultimately put it to the back of his mind, and decided to shift the conversation back to his initial intent. "So you are aware, then?" "Yes, it is increasingly starting to appear that was between the Qing dynasty and the great powers is an inevitability at this point. And if I'm being honest with you, Heidi, I requested this assignment." The young blonde beauty appeared as if she had just been dealt a mortal blow. She was not expecting Bruno to say that this was all his idea. In fact, she was going to ask if there was any way he could be reassigned until she heard that. Heidi couldn't help the tears that were forming in her eyes, as she asked why he felt the need to put himself in so much danger. "I just don't understand. Why would you do such a thing? Why would you knowingly request a position that is guaranteed to send you into combat? Aren't you afraid?" Bruno shook his head and sighed as he hugged the young woman and patted her head as he commonly did when they were children. It definitely helped her overcome the dread she was currently suffering from. There was a supremely confident tone in his voice, as he swore he would come back to her in one piece. "You wouldn't understand why I feel compelled to do this, even if I tried to explain my reasoning to you. Just know it is something I have made up my mind about. This is something that I need to do." Heidi would not try to persuade Bruno to abandon this desire of his. Though she couldn't understand what was worth risking his life and well-being over, she would support him in any way she could, even if that meant simply waiting for him to return to her. "All right, if you really must do this, then I will not stand in your way. But Bruno, you have to promise me you will come back to me alive and well. I can't stand to think about living all alone in this world for the rest of my life without you." Bruno chuckled when he heard this, and patted the young woman's hair once more, before pinning her on the bed and kissing her neck. In between his actions, he made a solemn vow that no matter what happened he would always return to her side. "No matter what may come my way, I will always find my way back to you, Heidi, this I swear to you." 2 weeks came and went in the blink of an eye, and before Bruno knew it he was out the door and being shipped off to China. As he had already suspected, the war, for the most part, was already over by the time he actually arrived. When he landed ashore in northern China, the Qing dynasty had already been forced to submit to the Eight-Nation Alliance. Despite this, 15,000 German soldiers from the East Asian Expeditionary Corps were still deployed to China to help stabilize the war-torn region, and in doing so, put down the remnants of the Boxer Rebellion. Counterinsurgency was the one thing that Bruno had actual combat experience with. Having been deployed to Afghanistan in his previous life for this very purpose, and he was confident in his ability to perform the role as needed, Bruno had been assigned to the East Asian Expeditionary Corps as an infantry officer, and naturally, his uniform reflected this. Current issued uniforms were still of the Prussian blue variety, as the field grey variants had yet to come into existence, and would not become a standard issue until years later. Normally, an infantry officer of this era would be equipped with a sword and a pistol as his standard issue weapons. But considering Bruno's father had achieved his goal of getting on the Bundesrat Land Army and Fortifications Committee, Bruno had used his family connections to get himself a rifle. The Dewey 98 was the standard issue rifle to the Imperial German Army at this time. And it was an excellent firearm at that, fed via stripper clips into an internal 5-round magazine. The Dewey 98 could deal death to an opponent at 1,000 meters via its potent 7.92 by 57 Mauser cartridge. Of course, one would have to have impeccable eyesight and expert marksmanship to pull off such a feat, which Bruno just so happened to have both of. In addition to his Dewey 98, Bruno had also gotten his hands on a Model 1900 Parabellum pistol, more commonly known as the 9mm Luger. Because of this, he was unusually well equipped for an infantry officer as he marched through the Chinese countryside at the head of his platoon. It had been 2 weeks since he had stepped foot in northern China, and until now, all he had been able to do was to perform the duties of a glorified sentry. Without expressed permission, he was not allowed to step foot outside of the base, and after 2 weeks of this, he had grown rather bored with his lot in life. Luckily for him, the company commander announced the night before that their unit would be going on a punitive expedition early in the morning into a region that was well known for Boxer activity. Aside from Bruno, the other platoon commander in his company was his old friend Heinrich from the academy. The two of them marched side by side, while smoking, as they chatted about their takes on the ongoing conflict, and the wasteland of a countryside they marched through. There's no doubt about it. This place has been thoroughly ransacked by the Eight-Nation Alliance and its forces. Heinrich nodded his head in agreement with Bruno's assessment of the situation. Whether it was another German unit before them, or one of the other great powers, the village in the distance that they were walking towards had clear signs of smoke in the air. The man took a puff from his cigarette before expressing his thoughts on the matter. "How much you want to bet it was the Russians? I've heard rumors from Eric. He has been sent out on patrol twice now, and both times he came across a town looted by the Russians. We're talking dead bodies in the streets, homes plundered for their wealth, and well, the women. It makes my heart bleed hearing what happens to them." Bruno took a long drag on his cigarette before exhaling a plume of smoke. It had only been a year since the first of the Hague Conventions were signed. It was an era where war crimes were a recent concept. However, while all the great powers had signed and ratified this convention and the stipulations within it that would protect prisoners of war and civilians, along with various other regulations on how to conduct warfare, China had not done so. And as far as the great powers were concerned, those who did not sign or ratify the Hague Conventions were not protected by its rules. It was because of this that Bruno had a more callous attitude when discussing the alleged atrocities of the Russian army. Unfortunate as it is, The Chinese really only have themselves to blame. Had they ratified the Hague Conventions like the rest of us, such actions would be considered war crimes and the men responsible would be held accountable for their actions. As much as I hate to say it, the most we can do is abide by the rules of war ourselves, even if our allies choose not to. We're neither generals nor heads of state. Like it or not, we simply don't have the power or authority to hold our allies to the same standards that we ourselves adhere to. Though Heinrich could understand the man's sentiment, he was a lot more empathetic towards the victims of the war than Bruno was. Bruno, however, was not the type to care about civilian casualties on a battlefield. In his past life, he had seen the effects that occurred when High Command prioritized the mitigation of collateral damage at the expense of total victory. And the results were not great. If it meant ending the Boxer Rebellion once and for all, then by all means he would give the command to shell an entire village if the insurgents were using it as their base of operations. From Bruno's perspective, such determination was needed to win a war. Anything else was just asking for operational failure. This was a perspective on warfare that Heinrich clearly did not understand, seeing as how he knew the man had no practical combat experience to speak of, despite being a commissioned officer. At least not at this time. While Bruno and Heinrich were casually chatting, an echo of gunfire rang throughout the distance, causing them and all their men to immediately become alert. Not a second after the shots had fired, the company commander issued the command for Bruno and his men to scout the area, and see what was happening in the village. "Lieutenant, take your platoon and establish a vantage point. I want to know what is happening in the village before we march into it. Report back to me after you have confirmed the situation." Bruno nodded his head, and threw up a salute to the captain, responding in the affirmative before taking the 40 or so men under his command to do as they were told. "Yes, sir." After saying this, Bruno ran off, with his rifle in hand towards the hill above the town, where he and his men took defensive positions under his orders. Even though the Boxers were primarily equipped with swords and spears, a few of them had firearms, and one could never be too careful when fighting a war. But when Bruno gazed upon the plundered village and the ongoing atrocities within it, even he had second thoughts about his more callous outlook towards warfare and the civilians affected by it. Bruno was quick to send a runner back to his company commander, informing him that the Russians had already assaulted the village. In response, he was given the order to regroup with the company in the town and help reinforce the Russian position. By the time he and his men managed to do this, the Russians had gathered a group of civilians, both men and women, and of all ages, where they had tied their hands behind their backs, while lining them up against a wall to be executed. The situation in the town was a disaster zone. It was one thing to shell an enemy position that was entrenched among civilians, and disregard those civilians and the casualties that would result in pursuit of destroying the enemy. But it was another thing entirely to loot, rape, burn, and pillage a village after victory had already been achieved. From Bruno's perspective, callous as it was, these things were simply unacceptable and truly met the definition of the term war crimes. Because of this, he did not immediately approach his company commander when he regrouped with his units. Rather, he walked up to the Russian officer in charge, restraining the urge to deck the man across the face, and instead shouted at him in Russian as if he were a Moscow native. "What the hell do you and your men think you are doing?" The Russian captain was surprised to see that a German officer spoke Russian so perfectly, and after snapping out of his daze was quick to respond to Bruno's question with a conceited smirk on his face. "These savages attacked my men as we peacefully entered the area with the intent to establish security in this war-torn region. We are only executing those responsible for crimes against the Tsar and his royal army." Bruno could not believe the audacity of these words. The people who were lined up to be executed were very clearly civilians who had been affected by this vicious retaliation. At the same time, women and girls were lying in the streets, whether lifeless, or in shock by the horrific crimes they had endured. Bruno did not know. All the while children appeared to be lying on the ground in pools of their own blood. The town itself had been set ablaze, and anything remotely of value was gathered in the center, where Russian soldiers carefully inspected it all to make sure it was something they could sell for profit. This wasn't retaliation, this was a complete and total massacre. Because of this, Bruno was completely and utterly disgusted by such reprehensible behavior. This was not how an officer in the service of a monarch was supposed to behave, let alone a nobleman, which, judging by the fact that Russia had just abolished serfdom a few decades prior, these officers most likely were of such status. With all of this in mind, Bruno could hardly control his temper as he grabbed hold of the Russian captain's tunic and chewed him out as if he were the man's superior officer. Have you gone utterly mad? These are clearly civilians. Even if there were Boxers among them who attacked your troops, does that justify such a massacre? And what of the women and girls I see lying in the streets, stripped naked and murdered by what I presume to be the hands of your men? How will you justify that? You are no better than common brigands. I will report these crimes to your commanding officer as soon as I am back at base. Just you wait. You and your men will be lined up in front of a firing squad before the week is over. The Russian captain, seemingly enraged by Bruno's threat, was quick to pull his pistol on the German lieutenant, an act of clear hostility against the German Empire. He tried to intimidate Bruno while his men were still harassing the locals in the background. Lieutenant, you must be new here, so allow me to give you a fair warning. This is how things are done in this backwards country. We are free to do as we wish now that the King government has surrendered. If you intend to cause problems for me and my men, then I have no qualms burying you in this savage wasteland. The fact that the Russian officer had pulled his revolver on Bruno had provoked a response by the German company of riflemen, who quickly raised their weapons towards the Russian soldiers who were roughly equal in number, albeit too focused on their criminal actions to notice immediately what had happened. Bruno acted on instinct, quickly grabbing the muzzle of the Russian captain's M1895 Nagant revolver and shifting it aside, while kneeing the man in the groin, ripping his revolver out of the man's hand, and pointing it towards its owner's temple, who had fallen to his knees and was throwing up his guts after having one of his testicles bust open by the vicious strike. There was a stoic expression on Bruno's face as he said the final words the Russian captain would ever hear before outright executing the man on the spot. You pulled a weapon on an officer in the Kaiser's army and deliberately threatened him in front of his men. Do not blame me for my lack of mercy. Bang! The shot resounded in the air as Bruno pulled the trigger, blasting the Russian officer's brains onto the grass by the wayside. The gunshot finally attracted the attention of the Russian soldiers, who were clearly intoxicated, no doubt having drank their fill of the village's local spirits. Upon seeing that an officer beneath his command had clearly been threatened by the Russian army, the German captain had no choice but to order his men to round up the Russian soldiers who had engaged in brigandry. His orders were expressed while he glared daggers at Bruno for provoking such a mess. Men, apprehend these brigands, and if they dare to resist, open fire on them. The Russian soldiers, having been too intoxicated and focused elsewhere to realize what had happened, quickly turned around to face the German soldiers with their rifles in their hands, provoking a response from Bruno, who ordered his men to massacre the Russians. Open fire. The German soldiers of Bruno's platoon opened fire on the Russian soldiers, killing dozens of them on the spot. Meanwhile, Heinrich, who was equally enraged as Bruno, if not more so due to his more empathetic nature, was quick to command his men to do the same. After all, the company commander had ordered the men to shoot the Russians if they resisted, and they were clearly doing so. You heard the lieutenant, open fire. The German captain felt as if he had just watched the world burn, as the situation rapidly spiraled out of his control. The German soldiers, acting under the orders of their officers, gunned down the Russian soldiers, who themselves were only able to fire off a few wild shots before being riddled with bullets. The exchange of gunfire only lasted a moment, but it was enough to cause a major international issue. Even so, once the Russian company was dead with their corpses bleeding in the streets, Bruno approached the various civilians who had been lined up for execution. He pulled his bayonet out of its scabbard and began cutting the ropes that bound their hands, speaking in Mandarin to them as he did so. Go. This village is no longer safe for you. When the Russians hear what has happened here, they will retaliate further." Bruno had shocked Heinrich with his mastery of 2 foreign languages, and was quick to approach Bruno commending the man, while the captain cleaned things up in the background. "You speak Russian, and Chinese? Since when?" A bitter smile formed on Bruno's face as he looked at what had happened here in this village. He shook his head before responding to Heinrich's words, almost as if his mastery of multiple languages was a simple thing. "I had a lot of spare time growing up, so I learned a few languages. It's not a big deal. Still, if you spoke Russian, then you would know what that bastard said to me." He said this is just how things are done here. So apparently, Russian soldiers aren't the only one engaging in such criminal acts across northern China. The Reich might be just as guilty as the Russians are. As Bruno finished saying this, the captain in charge of his company came up to him, practically foaming at the mouth as he slapped Bruno across the face. "You insolent cur! Do you have any idea what you have done here? If not for the fact that we have eyewitnesses who can attest that the Russian officer threatened you, this whole incident could spiral into a war between the Reich and the Russian Empire. Why did you have to open your stupid mouth? This is war, not some knitting contest. And these things are bound to occur. Stupid, Macron child. That's what you are. I'm going to have to report this to the lieutenant colonel when I get back to base. You should be prepared to face the consequences of your actions." Bruno had already known when he decided to confront the Russian officer that things would likely develop into the mess that they had. But if he had to sit idly by and watch innocent civilians be executed and raped in front of him, then he would rather put a bullet in his brain than live with such guilt. It was one thing to be ruthless in the pursuit of victory, or even to enact violent retribution upon partisans who unlawfully took up arms and attacked your soldiers. But, to behave so viciously towards unarmed civilians after the battle had already been won? That was simply the act of a savage, no matter how civilized he may proclaim himself to be. That was a solid belief that Bruno stood by, no doubt inspired by the ideals of the 21st century, which he had lived in during his previous life. And he would not forsake these ideals no matter what may happen to him as a result. Because of this, he was fully prepared to accept any consequences that might follow this conflict between German and Russian soldiers within King China that he had caused, and in doing so altered the timeline in ways he could not possibly have imagined. Upon returning to the base, the incident at the Chinese village was reported up the chain of command. Bruno was initially apprehended and put in the brig for his actions. But when the colonel reported the incident to the general in charge of the German occupation in northern China, a man by the name of Alfred von Waldersee, the general himself reported the incident to the Kaiser. As this was an international incident he did not want the responsibility of handling. Kaiser Wilhelm II was at home, peacefully enjoying his breakfast in Berlin when he received word of what had happened in China, and how the Tsar's forces were gearing up for retaliation against the German East Asian Expeditionary Corps for the massacre of their soldiers. Normally he wouldn't care about such a petty matter, and would instead order the execution of the man responsible for causing the incident in question as a means of appeasing the Russians. But when he heard the name Bruno von Zehntner, he was quick to take an interest in the subject. "You said the man responsible is Lieutenant Bruno von Zehntner. You mean the 9th son of Lord Bruno? How very interesting. Tell me exactly what happened." Once the Kaiser heard that the Russian soldiers were engaging in acts of brigandry against the local population, and that Bruno had valiantly confronted the criminals in question, only to be threatened with a pistol to the forehead for daring to say that he would report them to the proper authorities, the Kaiser was quick to scoff at the absurdity of the Russians and their attempts to spin this whole situation as if they were the victims. In fact, it truly aggravated him. The Kaiser was a man who had lofty ideals of warfare and notions of chivalry. Because of this, he became quite outraged at the whole scenario. My God, did such a thing really happen? Then why exactly is the lieutenant being held in the brig? If what you say is true, he confronted a group of brigands and responded appropriately to the situation. It's not like he ordered their execution on the spot. Instead he stated only that he would be reporting their crimes to the proper authorities. To think the Russian officer in charge had the audacity to pull his sidearm on one of my officers. Bruno should be commended for his actions, not condemned. Release him at once. Meanwhile, I will contact the Tsar and settle this whole dispute once and for all. Oh, and Chancellor, I want an immediate investigation to be held to see if any of our own soldiers are engaging in such unlawful activities during the occupation. If so, have them stripped of their ranks and titles before facing a firing squad. The Chancellor was not surprised the Kaiser would react this way upon hearing what really happened, or at least what happened from the perspective of the German soldiers who were there. As for the conversation between the Tsar and the Kaiser, the effects that discussion would have dire effects on future relations between the Russian Empire and the German Reich. By the time the German occupation of northern China was over, it was found that over 100 German soldiers had been engaging in similar crimes, resulting in their execution, as well as the stripping of their ranks and noble titles. In doing so, this sent an example to the German army that the rules of war must be followed at all times, even during an occupation of what many considered to be a savage land. Bruno was released from his cell a few days after the event, and during his captivity he had plenty of time to think about the consequences of his actions. His actions, though minor, would cause many changes in the timeline, not only here in China, but on a global scale. And the following 2 weeks of patrols proved this was correct. Bruno did not know exactly what transpired in the conversation between the Kaiser and their Tsar, but a full-on negotiation regarding zones of responsibility took place for the continued duration of the occupation of northern China. German and Russian soldiers had no direct contact with one another after the incident which Bruno was responsible for. And that was not the only change. Military police began a thorough investigation of German troops and their movements during their patrols and punitive expeditions. If anyone, no matter the rank or noble title, was caught engaging in crimes such as looting, murder of unarmed civilians, rape, etc., then they would be summarily executed via a firing squad. In addition to this, the Kaiser investigated what had been stolen from the Qing dynasty by its soldiers who did engage in acts of brigandry, finding that several cultural artifacts and relics were taken during the occupation. The Kaiser immediately ordered the return of these items to the Qing dynasty, and punished those responsible, as well as those up chain of command who either wittingly or unknowingly allowed such actions to take place. Bruno's reputation was mixed after this. For those with a sense of justice, he became an almost mythical figure, and was well respected among their ranks. But for those who had more sinister personalities, he became a blight, the man responsible for the eyes of the crown being set upon them. In addition to this, the company commander who scolded and recommended the imprisonment of Bruno following the incident at the Chinese village was demoted, whereas Bruno was given a promotion to take his place. In just a few weeks of being deployed, Bruno had been granted the rank of captain, and was now in charge of a full company of 200 riflemen, of which he had 4 officers beneath his command. 2 of them were Heinrich and Erich, who were far more willing to back Bruno's commands in the field than the other 2, whose loyalties were more towards their previous captain. Following the incident between Germany and Russia, the other nations of the Eight Alliance began to follow with Germany's strict adherence to the laws of war, not wanting to suffer a similar incident, or spark needless conflict between themselves and the German Reich. The way which the Eight-Nation Alliance conducted itself was vastly different than it had been in the life Bruno had initially lived. The amount of suffering caused to the Chinese people was mitigated out of a fear of provoking the Kaiser, whose sense of chivalry compelled him to punish his own men who engaged in such atrocities. After this issue was brought to his attention, the Kaiser simply could not ignore it, holding the East Asia Expeditionary Corps to a higher standard than they otherwise would have been as colonial soldiers. In addition to this, several nations began returning the cultural relics and artifacts that they had plundered during the initial fighting, and the first 2 weeks of the occupation. Still, a few nations did not comply with these standards. But for the most part, things had changed overall in this timeline. And Bruno estimated the consequences of his actions would have a far more severe effect in the years to come. For example, in 4 years a war would break out between Russia and Japan over disputes in the East. In the history of his previous life, the German Empire had provided an exceptional amount of material aid to the Russians during this war, and had even sent military advisors to aid them in their efforts. But unless the rift between the German and Russian armies, which Bruno had caused in this new timeline, was mended soon, then it would appear Germany would not be providing in this aid, and perhaps might even instead give it to the Japanese. If that were to happen, then it was entirely possible for the Japanese to side with the Central Powers during the Great War, meaning that German colonial possessions in the Pacific and East Asia would not come under assault by the Imperial Japanese military. This was all theoretical, of course, and Bruno had no way to prove these things would indeed occur, as there were still 14 years before now and the Great War. During this time, any number of things could happen to change the outcome of world politics even further, as this minor incident during the Boxer Rebellion had already done so. Still, the fact remained. Things had changed. The entire outcome of the Boxer Rebellion would be different as a result of Bruno's actions. And the immediate future, if not mended appropriately, would change as well. As a captain, Bruno had more degree of control over his unit, and whether or not they formed patrols or acted as sentries on base was up to his decision, or at the very least he could put in a request to the battalion commander. For him, spending his days on base was less than an idea. Not that it was particularly a bad experience, it was more so the fact that he felt his time and efforts could be better used in the field. And because of this, Bruno ordered regular patrols for his company, who marched into the northern Chinese countryside to pacify any Boxer remnants that still remained. After what he had done during his initial excursion into the field, the Chinese locals had a much better attitude towards Bruno, and the German soldiers in general. Thus, as Bruno marched alongside his soldiers into another village, with his Ju-98 shouldered, the local villagers came out to greet them. Though the soldiers under his command didn't speak Mandarin, Bruno did, and was quick to converse with the civilians who offered him and his men things like bags of rice to take back with them to their base. The soldiers under Bruno's command tried to march forward, as they refused the offers of gifts which the civilians tried to bestow upon them. As for Bruno, the village leaders came to greet him. They at first were making small talk with him, praising the Germans for the relatively benevolent way in which they treated the locals when compared to some of the other nations occupying China. But after a bit of conversation that Bruno found tiresome, one of the elders leaned in close and gave him a fair warning about the actual state of the village. This village is currently under the occupation of the Boxers. They are armed with rifles and are lying in wait for you down the main road. They intend to ambush you after the crowd disperses. Do not blame the villagers for distracting you. We have no choice in the matter. Bruno silently nodded at the village elder, which was his way of assuring the man he had heard what he said, and would not be taking retribution on the villagers for their act of deception. After doing this, he whistled towards Heinrich, who was busy flirting with the local women. When the man heard his rank and name shouted at him, he quickly snapped to attention. Lieutenant Koch. After forcing himself away from the local ladies, much to his own lament, Heinrich marched over to Bruno and was quick to ask the man what was happening. Captain, may I ask what is so urgent that you must pry me away from such lovely ladies? Bruno gave the man a stern gaze, looking directly at him, while facing his back to the Boxers down the main road. He gave the man a motion with his eyes that silently pointed towards the hostiles while he spoke in a low voice towards his lieutenant. I've got actionable intel from the village elders. Supposedly, this town is occupied by the Boxers. They are armed with rifles and are lying in wait for us within some of the buildings down the main road. You and your men are to circle around and flank their position. I want you to take the fuckers out before the rest of us walk in an ambush, understood? Normally Heinrich would be saluting Bruno in response to his orders, due to the difference in rank between them. But Bruno had ordered his men not to do such a thing when they were in an active war zone. The reason was simple: a salute signified that he was the officer in charge, and that could make him a target of the local insurgents. Which was a lesson he learned from his last life during his deployment to Afghanistan. Because of this, Heinrich nodded his head before regrouping with his platoon. He waved goodbye and blew a kiss to the local ladies before he and his men covertly split off from the company to perform the task they were given. The Boxer remnants had seized control of the local village a mere week before. It was an act of desperation as they had run out of supplies while hiding in the hills. They were equipped with a variety of rifles, some of which were looted from the soldiers of the Eight-Nation Alliance which they had killed in battle previously, while others were supplied by the Qing army prior to their defeat and occupation by the Great Powers. The man in charge of the local Boxer cell was equipped with a Hanyang Type 88 bolt-action rifle, which itself was a domestically produced copy of the earlier German Dewey-88. He was sitting and smoking, while one of his men armed with a French Lebel Model 1886 rifle aimed down his sights through the window of the building they were occupying for the sake of their ambush. The leader of these insurgents put out his half-smoked cigarette and slightly pulled back his bolt to ensure a round was chambered before approaching the man in the window with the Lebel rifle, tapping him on the shoulder while motioned with his head for him to take a break. "Relax. It looks like the locals are playing their part. It will be some time before the Germans come down this section of the road. Go take a piss. You have been standing there with your rifle raised for over an hour." The Boxer silently nodded his head and allowed the leader to take over his post. Having kept his rifle raised for an hour, his arms could truly use a proper rest. However, the moment he shut the door to the room behind him, and walked down the halls, he found himself face to face with a group of German soldiers who were progressing down the corridor with their weapons raised. The man was just about to call out to his friends, when Heinrich rushed forward with his rifle, and the bayonet which was attached to it, stabbing the man in the heart, and pinning him to the ground, where he put his foot over the Boxer's mouth, ensuring that he couldn't alert his fellow insurgents. The last thing the man saw as the light faded from his eyes was the sight of 5 German soldiers move beyond him, where they stacked up on the door, preparing to kick it open and kill the men inside. After thoroughly dispatching the Boxer to the afterlife, Heinrich rushed forward towards the door. He himself was quick to motion towards his men to do what was necessary. The door was kicked open immediately after, and the Boxers inside were startled by the fact that the Germans had discovered them. They tried to raise their weapons in response, but it was too late. The 5 German soldiers unloaded on them, spending their entire 5-round internal magazines riddling the Boxers with bullets. The last thought on the insurgent leader's mind was that he and his men had been betrayed by the villagers, and how they were a bunch of traitors to the Chinese nation for selling out their fellow countrymen to these foreign occupiers. Heinrich and his men quickly loaded another 5 rounds into their rifles with their stripper clips, tossing the thin sheets of metal aside after they were done with them. Once their weapons were properly armed, Heinrich sighed heavily. He and his men had spent the last hour climbing through these buildings, engaging in close quarters combat with the enemy, and this was the only time they had needed to fire their weapons. They had caught the enemy with their pants down, and now that it was over, he suddenly felt the urge to have a smoke. His hands trembling from the hour-long stress he had just endured, Heinrich reached out to the half-smoked cigarette which the Boxer leader had left in the ashtray, and finished it with a long and heavy drag. He and his men would regroup with the rest of the company shortly after, having only 2 of their soldiers suffering minor wounds, where, after performing first aid on the wounded, they would continue with their patrol. On this day, another village was liberated, and the German occupation in northern China was one step closer to coming to a proper end. Bruno and his company of riflemen would continue on with their patrol for the rest of the day, coming across several other Boxer rebels on their route. It was becoming increasingly clear that the Boxers were acting out of desperation. The overwhelming majority of their movement had been thoroughly obliterated in the early days of the conflict. What remained were a fraction of their initial numbers, many of which had resorted to banditry and brigandry in order to stay alive. Rumors of contact with the Boxer rebels spread like wildfire across the military base upon Bruno's return. It was a rare occurrence. After all, there weren't many of them left, and their remaining cells were spread across the northern Chinese countryside. Hiding where they could, and taking from the locals were never possible. To the men on the base it was surprising that Bruno's company had multiple incidents with the Boxer rebels, wiping them out to the last man in every encounter, while sustaining limited casualties. Under Bruno's watch, not a single man beneath his command had met an end. Albeit, some had been inflicted with minor wounds. It had only been a month or so since the occupation began, and already things were progressing smoothly on Bruno's end. He proved very quickly to have a mind for counterinsurgency. Having learned how to think like an insurgent in his experiences within Afghanistan, Bruno was uniquely in a position to anticipate when and where the Boxers would strike, and how they would do so. The battalion commander began relying more and more on Bruno's inputs, as his company alone appeared to having the most contact with the enemy. After weeks of conflict, things started to settle down, as less and less Boxers remained active participants in fighting against the foreign occupation. Currently, Bruno was in a room that one might consider being the officers' club on base. It was a common gathering place for commissioned officers, whether to discuss the war effort, or to simply have a smoke and a beer. Either way, Bruno refused to partake of alcohol while deployed, believing, even if he was located within the safety of the base, that there was always a danger present. And it was the fact that he was the only one completely sober in this discussion, which caused several of his peers within the battalion to make fun of him. "Every day we gather here to drink, smoke, and talk about the operations, and every day you refuse to do so, Captain von Zehntner. I'm starting to think you must be some kind of religious fanatic. Are you sure you don't want a beer?" Bruno was leaning against the wall in the back of the room, watching the other officers entertain themselves with nicotine and alcohol. He himself was in the act of smoking a cigarette when he responded to the captain's remarks. "On the contrary, I am the direct opposite of a religious zealot. In fact, I am quite open about my lack of faith. But even so, it is an objective truth that partaking of substances that dull the senses is incredibly unwise while you are in the middle of an active war zone. You never know when the base could come under attack, and what would happen if that occurred while the officers in charge were all intoxicated. My sobriety is a matter of professionalism, not morality." Which is something that you would know very little about Captain Muller. Bruno had been on the receiving end of Captain Muller's harassment ever since he was freed from his cell. The man was one of those officers who was investigated for war crimes. And while Captain Muller had been cleared of any potential wrongdoing, Bruno understood that the man was most definitely aware of what was happening and looked the other way the entire time. Combine that with the envy towards Bruno for the repeated successes in the field which culminated in gaining the ear of the battalion commander, and it was no wonder why several of the other captains treated him with hostility. The moment Bruno accused Captain Muller of lacking professionalism, he rose to his feet, clearly antagonized by the remarks, as well as slightly buzzed. Just enough that his judgment had been affected by it. However, before the May could properly aggress towards Bruno, the battalion command raised his voice. Having just entered the room to witness what was happening, "Captain Muller, stand down." The captain looked over at the lieutenant colonel, who called out to him and immediately felt himself sober up. It became abundantly clear as he was chewed out by the battalion commander that Bruno had laid the trap for him, making sure that he would make a fool of himself just in time for the lieutenant colonel to witness it. After being forced to sit down and remain silent, Captain Muller glared daggers at Bruno, who continued to smoke with a smug smile on his face. It was not until the lieutenant colonel began speaking about their upcoming operations that Bruno put out his cigarette and joined the other captains at the table. "All right, for starters, I would like to commend Captain von Zehntner for his excellent display of gallantry in the field. His company alone has the lion's share of kills, composing of 82% of all rebels killed in battle by this battalion. Now the reason I have gathered you all here is to announce our next punitive expedition. To put it simply, because of our battalion's repeated clashes with the enemy, they have now effectively been driven into a corner. With the losses they have sustained over the last few weeks, they are bound to be gathering in a single location. And thanks to input from Captain von Zehntner towards suspected areas of Boxer activity, our scouts have surveyed the region and found the last stronghold of which the remaining Boxers are hiding within. Captain von Zehntner, due to your accompanying you the honor of being in the vanguard as we assault the enemy fortifications, you will be supported by the battalion's attached artillery battery, who will bombard the Boxers' position prior to your assault. You will also be supported by Captain Muller and Captain Bauer's companies, who will be shortly behind you in the initial assault. If you have any questions or concerns for me, now is the time to voice them. Bruno remained silent as he looked at the map that was sprawled out in front of him. As he expected, the remaining Boxers in the region had holed up at the top of Mount Canyon within the Taihang mountain range. More specifically, they were likely using the Fortune Celebration Temple, which was built into the cliffside as a base of operations. This was an incredibly difficult position to assault for multiple reasons. To successfully eliminate the hostiles, one would need their forces to climb a single stone staircase up 360 steps to get to the summit, where the only way into the facility was via a stone arch bridge spanning across a narrow gorge. This bridge also acted as a support for the entire temple complex. Sure, they would be supported by artillery, but that had the potential to create catastrophic problems for them all. Assuming the 75mm field guns even reached the base of the summit and were positioned in a way that could successfully strike the temple, there was a very real possibility of an avalanche. Having arrived in September, and spent the last 2 months in China, it was now winter, and such a strike on a narrow cliffside could bring the entire mountain's worth of snow down on themselves with the amount of explosives they would be lobbing at it. When he thought about all of these potential consequences that had a high potential of becoming reality, Bruno was quick to voice opposition to the plan, even if it meant taking a much greater risk. With all due respect, sir, the enemy fortifications are located on a cliffside, which is directly beneath a steep incline. If we launched an artillery strike in such a location, the potential for causing an avalanche is high, higher than is worth taking such a risk. Besides, sir, the artillery battery attached to our battalion is equipped with field guns, not mountain guns. How exactly do you propose we haul those things up 1,000 meters worth of elevation? The flaws with this plan are myriad, and the risks to our own troops are even greater. The battalion commander had not thought through these matters. It was true that getting their field guns up the mountains would be a difficult task. And Bruno was right. They could bring down an avalanche on top of themselves if they tried to launch a strike on the enemy fortifications. But without artillery support, his men would quite literally be engaging in a frontal assault, as there was only one way to advance into the enemy position. The casualties would certainly be great if this happened. Because of this, he found himself at an impasse and was quick to ask Bruno how he thought they should best proceed, considering the fact that Bruno was the one who had clearly poked the holes in his strategy. You may have a point, Captain, but if we do not support the operation with artillery before the assault, then there will be mass casualties, as you and your men will be walking right into a fortified position. So if you have any better ideas on how to proceed, please enlighten me. Bruno indeed had a much better idea of how to handle the situation. However, it would require sending a message to his father, as well as the need to wait long enough for his prototypes to be manufactured, tested, and then shipped off to China from the fatherland. Because of this, he was quick to make this request, as he knew they were not in an urgent need to press forward, and that this was the best way to minimize casualties. Lieutenant Colonel, if I may be so bold, I have a plan that could effectively solve the flaws with our current strategy. However, you should be aware, this plan requires substantial preparations. Not only will I need to get in contact with the fatherland, but I will also need a month or two for the goods to be transported to our base. If you can promise to hold off the assault until these preparations are made, and simply encircle the enemy position in the meantime so that they cannot escape, I can guarantee you minimal casualties, while also assuring utter annihilation of the enemy." The lieutenant colonel was intrigued by this promise that Bruno had given him. Like Bruno had suspected, he was quick to grant approval, as the lives of his men were more important than a swift victory against the rebels and their last stronghold in the region. "So long as you keep your word, I will grant you approval to contact whoever you need to speak to in the fatherland. However, be aware, if this operation of yours results in a failure, or more casualties than are to be expected, I will hold you responsible for it." Bruno immediately saluted the lieutenant colonel, responding in the affirmative as he did so. "Thank you, sir." After saying this, Bruno was granted permission to send a telegraph back home, where he contacted his father, giving him the chemical formula for CS gas, or more commonly referred to as tear gas, while also creating the means for its deployment via the use of lightweight 80mm mortars. Lightweight mortars were an invention of the First World War. In the year 1900, mortars were generally very large-bore artillery pieces that required the same means of transportation as howitzers and field guns. They simply fired at a different arc, hence why they were called mortars. What Bruno had sent his father via telegram was a detailed account on how to manufacture a lightweight 80mm mortar that could be carried and operated on the move by a small team of men. It was a revolutionary concept for the year he was in, and had the potential to change the nature of warfare as the world currently knew it. That was assuming, of course, anyone other than the Germans learned about this device and how to copy it. The mortar he designed was based on the ones used by German paratroopers in WW2. In his past life, it was known as the KZ 8 cm GRW42. The weapon weighed 26.5 kilograms or 58.4 pounds and could be broken down into 3 pieces for ease of transportation. As for the chemical formula of CS gas, that would normally not be invented until the 1920s. And at this time, there was no outright ban on the use of chemical warfare, even though the first of the Hague Conventions was signed a year prior. Because of this, there were no moral qualms using tear gas to smoke the Boxer rebels out of the temple, and into the open where they could be fired on while in a temporarily disabled state. This also gave Bruno the ability to display his vast knowledge of mechanical engineering and chemistry for the first time since reincarnating in this world, knowledge which he had gained in both his past life and his current one. Bruno's father responded, affirming that he would begin the production of the 8 cm lightweight mortars immediately, and would use his powers as a member of the Committee for Land, Army and Fortifications to approve emergency deployment of the device once it had been tested briefly for functionality and safety. It would be a month or two before the prototype weapon was shipped off to China, and in there. Meantime, the battalion which Bruno served in would encircle the enemy at Mount Canyon while waiting for their revolutionary new weapon to arrive. The encirclement of the Boxers' last stronghold within the region was held for close to 2 months. There was only one way in and out of the temple, and it was secured by the German soldiers who took turns keeping watch. After only one attempt to leave the temple, which resulted in the deaths of 12 Boxers, the rebels stayed put within the temple for the remainder of the siege. At first they thought the Germans were trying to starve them out with their encirclement, but they had enough supplies to last through the end of winter, and because of this, they thought the German leadership was foolish to make such attempts. Eventually, however, the day arrived where the German battalion got their hands on a new prototype weapon. As it was Bruno's design, he quickly worked together with those men in his company who were most mechanically inclined, putting it together in no time. There were a few dummy rounds included in the munitions case, so that Bruno and his men could properly zero the weapon on the enemy's location. Nobody besides the battalion commander really knew what Bruno's plan was, nor did they understand what exactly Bruno and his men were fiddling with. From their perspective, it was a short and thin steel tube. They couldn't possibly comprehend that this one weapon would forever change the nature of warfare in this world. Bruno had no practical experience with operating mortars. In his past life, he was an infantry officer and was not adequately trained on their operation. But due to the fact that he designed the damn thing, based upon a newfound understanding of mechanical engineering via studying the subject in his life, and a basic comprehension of how mortars functioned in his past life, he figured it out pretty quickly. Once the weapon was zeroed in, Bruno ordered the men to launch one of the dummy rounds to test the weapon. The echo of the mortar round blasting off alerted all troops in the immediate vicinity as the shell flew up into the air, well above the target before falling down in the center of the temple plaza. To the boxers inside the complex, this was a bizarre sight. A metallic object shot up into the air and fell into their position, but it caused no damage to any of the structures, or the men within them. They began to laugh and shout at the Germans as if this was somehow a failure on their part. But Bruno ordered another dummy round to be launched just to ensure the weapon was indeed fixed in the right position. And again, an explosive blast echoed across the mountain range, while another inert round landed on the plaza, a foot or two away from the initial target. None of the boxers understood what was happening, or how the next round would be their undoing. But upon seeing that the prototype mortar was functioning flawless, Bruno gave an order to his company to take up positions at the bottom of the staircase and to be prepared to begin their assault. On my mark, prepare to charge the enemy. The men quickly got their weapons ready, and in position as they waited for the command. Bruno then gave the order for the mortar to fire. And when it did this time, the boxers weren't laughing anymore. The detonation of the airburst mortar round, which contained an aerosol version of CS gas, immediately caused all the men caught up in its mist to begin choking and oozing snot from their noses, while crying profusely. Yet it was not a single round which affected them. Bruno ordered the launch of all shells on the Temple Plaza complex. With each round fired, the mortar team became more and more competent at their jobs. The time between each round fired became shorter while they continuously fired into the Temple Plaza. Eventually the entire area was full of tear gas, while the boxers affected by it had no means to retaliate, and were instead flooding out of the fortified buildings and the makeshift defenses they had made, trying desperately to get some clean air to breathe. Once they were on their knees choking on the gas, Bruno ordered his men to assault the complex. They quickly rushed up the staircase, not suffering from a single round fired at them as they approached the Temple Plaza, remaining a safe enough distance away from the tear gas to not be affected by it. The German soldiers then formed ranks and opened fire on the temporary disabled rebels, who were riddled full of bullet holes by the sudden attack. Once the CS gas cleared, the German soldiers flooded into the complex, making short work of any boxers who remained. The assault ended as quickly as it began, and with no resistance from the rebels holed up inside the temple. Had the battalion not waited until the mortar and the tear gas arrived, then the casualties they would have sustained taking the temple complex would have been severe. Once it was confirmed that all rebels had been eliminated, Bruno ordered the team to break down the mortar and pack it back up. All the while the battalion commander approached him in shock at what he had seen. "I will admit, I was growing impatient waiting for this mysterious weapon of yours to arrive. Had I been forced to sit here for another week, I would have ordered the assault, regardless. But I'm glad I didn't. This thing you have here, I have never seen anything much like it before. It's like a mortar, but much smaller, and lighter weight, easily carried and operated by a small number of soldiers, even capable of being lifted up to such a high elevation with relative ease. The lives of hundreds of your fellow soldiers were spared because of you and your plan. Victory on this day is yours, Captain, not mine. I'm curious though, what exactly is this device you waited so long to get your hands on?" Bruno had a smug smirk on his face. He didn't take credit for the invention, rather he claimed it was the product of the engineers who worked for his father. "You should thank my father's company, and the talented men who work there as engineers and chemists. Without them, this new lightweight mortar would not exist in this world." To a certain extent this was true. Bruno might have a proper knowledge of mechanical engineering and basic chemistry, but he was not omniscient. though he had knowledge of the future about how mortars would come to evolve later on in this century. He himself got many things wrong when designing it. These errors were solved by his father's engineers, and the chemists they collaborated with to come up with the functional designs of the two weapons that they were currently testing in the field. As for the lieutenant colonel, he couldn't help but suspect Bruno played a larger role in the development of the lightweight mortar and CS gas than he was letting on. Still, he didn't bring these suspicions up, and instead made a comment about how warfare would forever be changed as a result of this weapon. Whoever is responsible, the Reich owed them a great deal. I will write to the general personally and tell him about this wonderful new mortar your family has developed. With any luck, we can keep this weapon a secret from the other great powers, giving us an edge should the day come where we must take up arms against them. With that said, the mortar which Bruno designed would be further developed, tested, and experimented on. In the coming years, the German Empire would keep the existence of their lightweight mortars a secret from their rivals on the global stage. While further expanding on a variety of calibers, they could successfully be chambered in. While Bruno continued to contribute to the occupation of northern China by the Eight-Nation Alliance, his wife was at home waiting for his return. It had been nearly 3 months since Bruno first left Heidi's side, and by now, there was a noticeable bump on her belly. The last time Bruno had visited Heidi, he had just graduated from the academy, and was granted 2 weeks of leave to spend with his wife before being deployed overseas for the foreseeable future. During this time, he had thoroughly impregnated the woman. He had the opportunity to do so over the holidays while he was in his final year of the academy, but chose not to for a series of complicated reasons. This time, however, his perspective had shifted. Seeing as he was about to enter a war zone, Bruno saw it as a prudent time to leave an heir behind, as doing so would ensure that his family would provide for Heidi should the worst happen to him during his deployment. Of course, Heidi had only found out she was pregnant a month or so after Bruno had left her side. Currently, she was sitting on the sofa, while wondering what kind of expression Bruno would make when he found out he was a father. Heidi was so entranced with the idea of being a proper family together with Bruno that she had forgotten an important letter was supposed to arrive today, and it took her some time to regain her clarity where she immediately fetched the mail, which should have arrived by now. When she saw the seal on the letter and the family which it belonged to, she was quick to take a deep breath before opening it. Once she did so, she read its contents. The message itself, if read plainly, was merely an exchange of pleasantries between two family members. But when decoded in the way that Heidi and her cousin had agreed upon, it read as follows. Dear Lady Heidi von Zehntner, it has been some time since I last sent you a letter. I regret to inform you that I have been quite busy as of late. What, with the nature of my work, is it any wonder that I have been unable to properly communicate with you? You will be pleased to know, however, that I have not forgotten your request, and have been following the career of your husband quite closely. No doubt this is the least I can do to repay the favor which my beloved little sister owes you. There has been much talk of your husband, Captain Bruno von Zehntner, and his contributions to the war efforts around the office, and I have it on good authority that the old-timers in the Central Division even plan to have him attend the Prussian War College once the war is over. That is, of course, contingent on his continued success in the field. If your husband continues to perform in the way he has so far, then the man has a bright future in the army, and may even one day become a general. I know you worry about his safety, as I'm sure my sister would feel the same were I in your husband's situation. But you can rest assured knowing that if the rumors are to be believed, he is deeply concerned about his own safety and the men beneath his command. If so, he won't needlessly put himself in danger. And with the attention he has been gathering, I doubt his commanding officer would risk such a thing as well. I only have one other thing to report. I do not intend to worry you about this matter, as it is currently being taken care of by my friends in the field. But there appears to be a conspiracy among several of your husband's fellow officers to eliminate him, and play it off his death in the field as a fatality caused by the enemy. As I previously stated, you do not need to worry about this matter, as I already have my men working on apprehending the conspirators and bringing their criminal actions to light. By the time you read this letter, they should already be in prison awaiting their execution. That is all I have to report for now. I do look forward to a time where you and my sister can get together once more. After all, you are now officially a noble lady, albeit through marriage, and there is no reason for the two of you to hide your friendship any longer. In the meantime, I will continue to monitor the situation regarding your husband's career, and let you know if there are any further developments. You will always have friends among my family and those of our allies, no matter what kinds of games your bastard of a father may play at. Sincerely, your cousin, Prince Karl Georg von Bentham-Steinfurt. Heidi smiled at the letter before raising it over a nearby candle, and lighting it aflame. It, along with the words contained within, were thoroughly burnt to ashes. After all, it was quite the criminal act for her cousin to report classified and internal military information to her. And the last thing she wanted was for the man to get in trouble. After all, if he came under investigation, then it would be revealed that she used a favor which the Princess of Bentham-Steinfurt owed her from their years together as children, to coerce a military officer into giving her classified intelligence on the war in China. If such a thing occurred, then she could be in serious trouble along with her cousin Karl Georg, who worked as an analyst at the Information Division of the German Army's High Command, which was Imperial Germany's Foreign Intelligence Bureau. But Heidi was just so worried about Bruno's well-being, that she could not help but check up on him. Nevertheless, the two of them took precautions in the sharing of such sensitive information, creating their own form of encryption to exchange letters freely and openly without anyone thinking the wiser. Which, after burning the evidence, Heidi pulled out a pen and paper, and began to write back to her cousin in the same encryption style of the letter she had received. What the letter contained exactly, only the two of them would ever know. But suffice to say, the timid little rabbit that Bruno had married had more connections that could aid him than he could possibly realize. Chapter 17, An Opportunity for Promotion. A rather shocking event followed the victory at Mount Canyon. Though peace had finally settled in the region which Bruno's unit was responsible for the occupation of, especially with the threat of the Boxer remnants eliminated, controversy immediately arrived, as the military police arrested several soldiers. Both non-commissioned officers and commissioned officers were implicated in a plot to assassinate Bruno. Among these conspirators included Captain Muller, who Bruno had frequently feuded with over petty matters. However, despite this sudden turn of events, Bruno was not entirely surprised. His actions thus far had definitely made many enemies. However, what did astonish him was the fact that an officer within the military police approached him, and whispered something to him that seemed significant even if Bruno was unaware of it. Your friends in the Information Division send their regards. Friends in the Information Division? Bruno was naturally aware of what this organization was. It was essentially the Department of Military Intelligence for the Imperial German Army. But why exactly was someone in the Information Division watching his back? As far as he was aware, he had no contacts in such an important organization. Still, Bruno simply acted as if he knew what the military police officer was talking about, putting on a stern section aide, and nodding his head as he thanked the man for his efforts. You and the boys back at the division have my thanks. If you ever need anything that I can help with, you know where to find me. It didn't hurt to establish ties with the military police and the officers within it, especially since the military police seemed to have a good impression of Bruno as a man of justice like many of its members were. And because of this, the military police officer nodded and assured Bruno if he needed his support, he would come look for him. After which, the conversation ended, as the military police had far more important matters to attend to. After a list of officers and senior NCOs were dragged off to await their court-martial and sentence, the lieutenant colonel in charge of the battalion in which Bruno was a part of approached him and apologized on behalf of the unit. I'm sorry, Captain. I was unaware that the men beneath my command were conspiring against you. You have proven to be an exceptional member of this unit, and to think they would reward your merit with such treachery. I'll make sure that the new officers who replace them are well aware of the consequences of such behavior." Bruno nodded his head and accepted the lieutenant colonel's apology. It's not like he could tell the man to go fuck himself because he was ignorant of such a conspiracy against one of his officers. I mean, hell, Bruno was ignorant of it as well. Still, he was curious why the information division was protecting him. Who within their ranks had he impressed to such a degree? Bruno couldn't possibly know that it was his wife Heidi who had used her connections with the other half of her family, which she was more friendly with, to keep an eye on him and anyone who might be moving against him. Nor could he know that his actions so far had thoroughly impressed military leadership, who once they became aware of this conspiracy, would make moves to protect Bruno. After all, if he continued on such a path of success and innovation, then he was a future general worth fostering. The next 2 weeks were relatively peaceful. The battalion which Bruno was attached to continued their patrols, to ensure that the countryside within their area of responsibility was both pacified and stable. But with the Boxers in the area having been fully wiped out at Mount Canyon, there was no trouble to be had on their patrols. Instead, Bruno was approached by his battalion commander, and sequestered in the man's office for a private conversation, which immediately made Bruno suspicious. It was rare for him to have a private conversation with the lieutenant colonel, and after recent events he suspected it would be a serious matter. "Please sit down, I have an important matter to discuss with you." Bruno did as he was told and waited patiently for the lieutenant colonel to begin the conversation. But the man seemed more concerned with making Bruno comfortable as he reached into his cabinet and pulled out some distilled spirits that had been brewed by the locals. It was part of his private stash, which, after pouring a glass for himself, he gave one to Bruno as well. Bruno initially rejected the offer with a motion of his hand, but the lieutenant colonel seemed unusually insistent as he commanded Bruno to drink with him. "Drink," I commanded. "Believe me, you're going to want to loosen up for this conversation." Considering the severity of his statement, Bruno did as commanded and downed the whole glass of alcohol in a single gulp, surprising the commander, who thought that Bruno's sobriety was a sign of his feebleness towards alcohol. Bruno was not the least bit intoxicated. He was an experienced drinker, after all. Having his fill of beer, wine, and distilled spirits after becoming an adult, it was a natural part of noble celebrations and feasts to drink to your host. After seeing Bruno had drank the alcohol, the lieutenant colonel sighed before getting straight to the point. "Let me just come out and say it. The French have requested our aid in the territory which they are occupying. They have suffered small losses over these past few months, and apparently word has reached their ears that we have already pacified the area under our responsibility. Because of this, they are requesting armed support. And since you are the man who has proven to be most capable of combating the rebels, I have decided to dispatch you and your company to advise the French on how to defeat their adversaries. No doubt this will put you in needless danger, and you have more than proven yourself here in China. So much so, I am making an unusual exception by allowing you to reject my request if you simply desire to sit back and relax at the base for the rest of the winter. But I will have to dispatch someone else to take your place, and with Captain Muller and several of the other officers having been arrested for conspiracy of assassination, I am left with very limited options." Bruno remained silent for a short while as he thought about what was happening. It was January 1901, after a nearly 2-month-long siege of Mount Canyon and the temple which the Boxers were hiding within. The end of the German occupation was rapidly approaching. Through his actions, Bruno had sped up the German victory in China, and it was entirely possible that within the next few weeks the East Asia Expeditionary Corps would be disbanded, and its volunteers would be returning home to the fatherland, something that was supposed to happen in the spring according to his previous life's history. If he went home now, he would have more than made a name for himself, that would allow him to gain favorable positions in the army going forward. But, if he took up this offer to advise the French, he may be left behind longer than the rest of the battalion. Even then, acting as a military advisor to the French, and proving himself capable in such regards, may very well open the door to a similar role in a few years when the Russo-Japanese War broke out. With these ambitions in mind, Bruno ultimately decided to accept the position. "Lieutenant Colonel, you don't have to worry. I will have the Boxer remnants defeated by the time the snow melts, and the leaves bloom from the trees." It was an arrogant promise. After all, it was currently January, and Bruno did not know the exact nature of the French situation right now. But he had more than 2 months to fulfill his promise, and as far as he was concerned that was all he needed. The lieutenant colonel smiled when he heard this and was quick to respond to Bruno's bold claims with a promise of his own. "If you really accomplish that, I will personally send a recommendation to the Central Division that they make an exception and consider accepting your application to the Prussian War College after this war is over." Bruno was surprised to hear this, but it gave him even more motivation to accomplish the task within the time frame that he had boasted. Admission to the Prussian War College was highly selective. Normally, one would require a minimum of 5 years' service as an officer just to be able to apply for the exams, which themselves had a high failure rate. Of course, exemplary performance on the battlefield had a way of hastening one's promotion. Wars weren't exactly something that happened every year. One could go an entire military career without seeing combat, and even a few months of battlefield experience gave Bruno an edge over his competitors who had stayed out of the Boxer Rebellion. Still, only 100 applicants would normally be admitted to the Prussian War College, and after 3 years' worth of education and exams, those who graduated were between 5 and 8 in total. Such an attrition rate was comparable to Special Forces selection in the 21st century. However, those who graduated from the Prussian War College were permanently posted to fill vacancies in the general staff, meaning that if Bruno succeeded in this endeavor, he would become one of the youngest generals in the history of the German Empire. Meritocracy was the name of the game, and since Bruno had proven himself an exceptional officer in the field, despite only being commissioned for roughly half a year, he may very well get his wish. Of course, there was an equal chance someone higher up in the ranks who was jealous of his rapid rise would block his attempts to enter the Prussian War College, meaning he would have to slog on for another few years, before meeting the minimum requirements to apply again. Either way, there was plenty of time until the Great War began, which was when Bruno needed to become a general by if he were to change Germany's destiny, and hence he had plenty of time to prepare. Either way, Bruno accepted his new post and was quickly transferred along with his unit to advise the French on counterinsurgency tactics. Captain Leon Sinclair was a French military officer. He was a few years older than Bruno, and had served in the French army for 4 years prior to the outbreak of the Boxer Rebellion. He was among those units who were first to fight in the conflict, and had taken part in multiple battles so far including the Battle of Peking. Still, his unit had suffered these past few months from repeated ambushes and other skirmishes with the Boxers, while the Boxers were primarily armed with swords and spears, believing their Inichi could protect them from bullets, making them easy to deal with. There were those among them with a more realistic approach to warfare. These units would hide behind cover, and making use of firearms and explosives to deal with the French. The casualties which the French army sustained so far were minor, but no less than 24 of Leon's own soldiers had either been wounded or killed in action. Meanwhile, the Germans had already dealt with the Boxers in all the areas which they occupied. As a result, the general in command of the French occupational forces requested support from the German army, something that was humiliating to even think about for many of its soldiers. Leon's father was killed in the Franco-Prussian War, and as a young boy, he watched as the Prussians and their allies marched into the French Palace of Versailles and declared themselves a new empire, which they boldly stated was the new and supreme authority over Europe, thus ending French hegemony in the continent. To say he fully supported French revanchism was an understatement. Leon hated the Germans and the humiliation they had caused him, his family, and his nation. He would never forget, and he would never forgive. Thus, it was no surprise when the ruddy-haired man spat on the ground in front of Bruno's feet when he came face to face with the advisor who the Germans had sent to aid them in their efforts to put down the Boxer remnants. Leon was not afraid to speak his mind, however he did so in French, believing that the Germans couldn't understand him. To think our general would stoop so low as to ask the Boche for help. What a coward! Bruno simply smirked when he heard the disrespect coming to him from the French officer. He spoke in perfect French, shocking Leon and his troops as he insulted the French army. Perhaps if you bigot munching surrender monkeys were remotely capable of performing your jobs, we wouldn't be here to teach you how to properly wage war. The silence that existed after this was deafening, as the French stared at Bruno with wide and hateful eyes. Needless to say, the tension between the two units immediately reached a breaking point. Chapter 18, Attaché to the French Colonial Army. The term which Bruno had used to insult the French soldiers was one taken from his past life. Whether it was invented or merely popularized in the late 20th century, Bruno was not entirely aware, but its origins lie in with the French surrender in 1940, a mere 6 weeks after the conflict with Germany began. This was something that Americans had never let the French forget, despite actually being allied with the French resistance throughout the remainder of the war. And naturally certain more nationalist-leaning Germans had picked up on the term. Because Bruno had his memories from his past life, he was quick to shove the insult in Leon's face after the man had blatantly disrespected him, first by spitting in his direction, and then by using a French derogatory term for the German people. He had not provoked the man at all, but the revanchist sentiment was strong among the French population following their defeat in 1871. And this hatred for the Germans would continue for decades to come, culminating in their declaration of war against the German Reich in 1914, as well as the imposing of the abominable Treaty of Versailles in 18, which due to the punitive actions taken against the German Empire, for literally no reason other than French pettiness, ended up being a direct cause for the Second World War a mere 2 decades after the fact. No doubt Leon would be one of the men lining up in 1914 to fight against the Germans, and assuming he stayed in the French army until then would probably be a high-ranking officer by then, far more powerful than he currently was. But Bruno would not let the Germans be defeated in this timeline now that he had been given a chance to change the future. Hell, he had already changed the timeline with several minor actions in the Boxer Rebellion. As for Leon, he naturally took the term Bruno had used as an insult for the French surrender in 1871, despite just now hearing it for the first time in his life, and was damn near ready to attack Bruno for his words, despite him himself starting the dispute. That is, until the French general who invited Bruno and his men stepped in and diffused the situation. What is going on here? Captain Sinclair, I hope you are not causing trouble with our new advisors? Leon was forced to cease any further hostilities he had planned when Major General Henri Nicolas Frey stepped forward to personally welcome Bruno to the French-occupied territory. He immediately threw up a salute to the French general, as did Bruno and his men, as a sign of respect for the man's position. General, I was merely introducing myself to the German captain. Although General Frey eyed Leon with suspicion, being well aware of the man's prejudices towards the Germans, he did not say anything further, instead stepping past his own officer to greet Bruno, and was quite friendly in his introduction. Major General Henri Nicolas Frey, it is a pleasure to meet the man who is responsible for the victory at Mount Canyon. I must say, a tricky situation you found yourself in. The enemy holding up in fortified temple complex with only one entry point, exposed to enemy fire, and a steep cliff above full of snow preventing you from striking it with artillery? I don't know how you managed to eliminate the rebels without a single casualty, but assuming we have the time I would love to hear the details of your strategy. Bruno was surprised how well versed the general was in his victory that took place not too long ago. However, he would not dare reveal how he emerged victorious, as to do so would be to leak a powerful advantage the German army was now preparing for future conflicts. Man-portable mortars had the ability to change the nature of WWI. After all, When they came into prominence, especially in WW2, they had pretty much replaced the nature of heavy static machine guns, which trench warfare in 1918 relied heavily upon. Bruno also had plans to implement better machine guns, but he would need to rise through the ranks of the German army, and further exploit his father's connections to the Land Army and Fortifications Committee if he wanted to implement these designs into service. Thus, he simply responded cordially, dismissing the French general's request in the politest way possible. "I'm not one to boast, but if the general wishes to hear about the victory at Mount Canyon in more detail, I'm afraid it will have to wait until after we have solved your insurgency problem. My men are more than willing to provide support wherever needed, but I do want to make it clear we are here in an advisory capacity and do not intend to be thrown into position as a replacement for your own soldiers." General Frey laughed at Bruno's words. He was indeed surprised the man could speak so fluently, and with a dialect that made it seem he was like a native Parisian. Nor did he take Bruno's last remarks seriously, as he assured Bruno his soldiers would not be seeing any actual combat during their patrols and punitive expeditions. "Not to worry, lad, I assure you my men are more than up to the task of fighting these damned rebels, but your insight on how to best deal with them would be most welcomed." After this, the general left his captain behind, while taking Bruno, as well as the platoon commanders beneath Bruno's command, to a more sheltered area where they discussed at length the best way to draw out and eliminate the rebels. Following a similar path that the Germans had used to thoroughly annihilate the Boxer remnants in their area of occupation. And before long, Bruno found himself, interestingly enough, on horseback riding beside the French general who deployed his battalion into the snowy countryside to hunt down and eliminate the rest of the Boxers. Bruno's company was in the rear, protecting himself, and the general, alongside the artillery which would be used to pound the enemy positions when spotted. As for General Frey, while he and Bruno smoked cigarettes on horseback, he was quick to ask Bruno's opinion on the war, and the region in general. "You're young, younger than a captain ought to be. I heard about that nasty business with the Russians. I presume the fact that you wear the insignia of a captain on your shoulders means that you replaced the blathering fool who tried to reprimand you for standing up against violations of The Hague. Just because the Chinese did not sign or ratify the convention, does not mean that we who belong to nations who had done so should not be expected to abide by them. It's a sickening loophole, and I'm glad someone put a stop to it." Bruno was surprised that the French general was in agreement with him in this regard. Initially, he was callous towards the plight of the locals, believing that they themselves were to blame for not signing the Hague Convention of 1899. Despite this, Bruno quickly shifted his opinion when he actually witnessed the atrocities committed in front of him. Reading about war crimes that had happened in the past, and witnessing them in person, were two completely different things. At that moment, his conscience wouldn't allow him to simply stand by and watch as war crimes were committed in front of him. Sure, he had suffered quite a bit because of what he did, but at the end of the day, he didn't regret it, and he was quick to give voice to this sentiment. It was moments before we stumbled across the ransacked village that I rather coldly stated to one of my fellow officers that there was simply nothing we could do about such things. That we weren't powerful enough to compel others to follow the same standards that we ourselves adhered to force others to abide by our values and how conducted ourselves in a time of war. And yet, no more than 5 minutes passed before I came across the scene of the Russian soldiers and the crimes they were committing. I was aware that these things were happening, and I didn't care until I was confronted with it, forced to witness it with my very eyes. I'm not a sentimental person, nor an empathetic one. Had the Boxers used the village as a stronghold, I would have ordered it to be shelled without hesitation or remorse, even if the entire town's civilian populace died in the barrage. But there's a big difference between being ruthless in the pursuit of victory, and being sadistic towards those who have already surrendered. What the Russians did was wrong, and my conscience did not permit me to simply walk away and pretend it wasn't happening. The consequences of my actions are no doubt more severe than I currently understand them to be. and may very well lead to future friction with the Russian Empire. Yet at the very least, they helped put an end to the needless suffering that was taking place here. After everything that happened, I came to realize that despite being a mere lieutenant, my actions have more power than I could have possibly imagined when I first landed in this country. The French general remembered every word that Bruno had spoken. At first, he had assumed the man was the sentimental type for the way he treated the locals. But when Bruno revealed he had no qualms shelling a position held by the enemy, even if civilians were doomed to be caught in the blast, he began to realize that the young German captain in front of him was a man of significant fortitude. Bruno wasn't a monster. He had no desire to inflict suffering on anyone could it be avoided. At least not based on what he had just said, and the actions he had taken so far. But he was by no means a saint. If given the chance to engage in evil for the sake of victory, he would disregard his soul and take the path of least resistance to triumph. Given the chance to rise to a prominent position in the German army, Bruno would be a formidable enemy in the years to come should Germany and France find themselves at war. And because of this, General Henri Nicolas Frey made a mental note of the name Bruno von Zehntner. The French general would be keeping a close eye on the Bruno's exploits during the years that followed, let alone the next few months as they fought together to put an end to the Boxer rebellion, or more specifically those remnants who still dared to take up arms. Bruno spent the next month identifying and mapping out the exact locations where the Boxer remnants would hide when he and General Frey were plotting the French punitive expedition. Through repeated skirmishes with the enemy, he had discovered their precise whereabouts, and the locations they were most likely to set up ambushes. Unfortunately for him, despite the fact that his presence was requested by the French colonial army in an advisory capacity, General Frey had largely neglected his suggestions, and repeatedly walked into enemy attacks without a regard for the advice Bruno had given him. Whether it was because the French general was testing him, and his knowledge of the enemy tactics, or simply because he thought having a German advisor was a mere novelty. The initial pleasantries which General Frey greeted Bruno with had become nothing short of tiresome at this point. Today was no different, with the French general yet again ignoring Bruno's advice, and in doing so, marched his troops directly into an ambush that Bruno had predicted with absolute precision. The Boxers who took part in the attack were not of the normal variety which Bruno had come into contact with during his time in the German-occupied zone. These men, for the most part, did not wield firearms and explosives to a degree of proficiency that was worthy of being called an insurgency. Rather, these were the more common variety of Boxers, those that Bruno honestly had no idea how they survived this long when considering their delusional take on warfare. For whatever reason, the Boxer movement, or at least those in charge, had convinced thousands of men that with their Qigong powers they could render bullets useless against their flesh, as well as perform other feats that simply were not possible if one were living in objective reality. Perhaps if the world functioned off of the tropes that were commonly found in Eastern fantasy novels, then these things could be true. But in the real world, such ideas were delusional. There was no such thing as magic in this world, and because of this no matter how hard you tried to channel your chi you were not going to stop a bullet from taking your life. These Boxers however had a damn near religious faith in their alleged Qigong powers, and charged at the French colonial soldiers wildly from beneath a nearby ridge where they had waited for the enemy to approach. It took some time for the French to adjust their weapons so that they were properly aligned with the enemy's assault. Bayonets had not been affixed, and because of this the French soldiers fired off a single and shaky volley at the enemy. Using the same tactics with their Lebel 1886 bolt-actions rifles that they would have used if this battle was taking place 50 years earlier when muskets ruled the land. This only made it easier for the Boxers, armed with swords and spears, to inflict casualties on the French soldiers. With the first line falling quickly by the wayside, they had walked right into an ambush yet again. This was despite Bruno's previously warning that there was a high likelihood the enemy would be lying in wait at ridge. Bruno sighed heavily and shook his head as he pulled out a pack of cigarettes and lit a smoke. Meanwhile, General Frey, who looked through his binoculars, was honestly surprised that Bruno's hunch had proven correct, and rather haphazardly responded as if the injuries his men were currently sustaining were not a big deal at all. "Well, I'll be damned. It would appear that you were correct in your assumption, Captain. I suppose it would have been wise to follow your advice to proceed with caution and fix bayonets before marching past the ridge." Despite the fervor in which the Boxer remnants fought, they were ultimately outnumbered by the French army, who managed to fix their bayonets and fight in the melee together with the enemy, ultimately winning the skirmish, albeit while suffering minor casualties. More than 24 men were wounded in the ambush, and another 6 had been killed outright. After finishing a long drag on his cigarette, Bruno flicked it away, which fell by the wayside of the horse which he was mounted on. His voice was more stern than it should be as he responded to General Frey's whimsical statement. "You requested my presence here so that I could advise you. I would assume that from now on you will listen to my advice, yes?" General Frey was honestly a bit resentful that his gut instinct had proven to be incorrect this time. And because of this, he sighed, and nodded his head, before confirming what Bruno had already suspected. "I suppose there is more to your methods than I initially thought there would be. Very well, if you have a suggestion, I will hear it now." Bruno pointed towards the lines of the Boxers that were beginning to break and rout. His voice was cold, almost icy, as he advised to strike the fleeing rebels with artillery so that they could not return to their base of operations with their lives intact. "The last thing we need is these arseholes returning to their base of operations and reporting our position to their comrades. I have a general idea of where they are hiding. What you need to do is line up the artillery battery you have accompanying this infantry battalion, and open fire as soon as they get out of danger close range. What remains of the Boxers should be wiped out by the barrage. And I would suggest you do so quickly, lest we lose an opportunity to gain the advantage." Frey did not hesitate to listen to Bruno's advice any longer, yelling at his artillery battery to get the guns in position and to open fire on the fleeing enemies as soon as they were out of range of the French soldiers on the front lines. It took longer than Bruno would have wanted for the French artillery battery to get their guns deployed and in action, but with several large explosions in the distance, what remained of the Boxer remnants who had ambushed the French were thoroughly turned into mincemeat. After which, General Frey was quick to inquire as to whether or not Bruno actually knew the whereabouts of the remaining Boxers. "So, were you telling the truth? Do you know where the Boxer remnants are hiding?" Bruno nodded his head and was quick to yell at one of his soldiers in German, which General Frey did not understand. "The map. Get me the map." A soldier quickly ran past Bruno and gathered the map before handing it to his commanding officer. Once Bruno received it, he spread the piece of paper out and pointed at 3 locations within the mountain range where the Boxers were most likely hiding, or what remained of them within the French occupation zone. "We have 2 options on how to proceed. The first option is to take the men that are with us at this moment and assault the enemy positions, which would require a 3-day march from our current location. After doing so, we can encircle the enemy fortifications and lay siege to them. With our current artillery, we only have enough manpower to bombard a single location, meaning the other 2 units would have to take their objectives with a head-on assault. Such a thing would incur heavy casualties, but would end the campaign as quickly as possible. The other option is to fall back to our base of operations and in doing so, gather our reinforcements, recruit the efforts of every soldier in the area who can fight, other than those necessary to maintain the garrisons, and then use those forces to surround the 3 enemy strongholds and take them all out at once, preferably via triggering an avalanche in each zone with our artillery. The choice is up to you how to proceed, but if it were me, I would choose the secondary option. It's a safer and more sure way to eliminate every single hostile with a single coordinated campaign." General Frey thought about Bruno's remarks for some time in silence. Both options were viable solutions to the problem at hand, but it would easily take a week or 2 to gather the necessary reinforcements, let alone march them to the enemy strongholds. Still, the extra artillery would be a godsend, and triggering an avalanche on each location would be a way to eliminate the enemy by expending their own blood in the process. Because of this, he chose the second option. It was not like the enemy had anywhere to go now that the winter was at its fiercest. As for Bruno, he didn't care either way. He was still well within the time frame he had been given to accomplish the task by his commanding officer, and it was not like the blood that would be shed was that of his own men. However, Bruno was indeed surprised when General Frey chose the safer of the two options, which would take longer to finish this campaign, but he did not refute the man's choice, and instead helped coordinate the mustering of thousands of French soldiers and the accompanying artillery batteries for the sake of the winter campaign. It had been nearly a month since the French colonial army in King China began mobilizing its forces to assault the 3 remaining Boxers' strongholds within the occupational zone, and currently, the Boxers were heating up their hands over the fire. The winters in northern China were cold, especially for the locals. And today was a particularly brutal day, the winter winds kissing the cheeks of those unfortunate enough to not have some form of shielding from the elements. The men were bundled up in as thick of winter clothing as they could get their hands on, trying desperately to stay warm, though they had sent out in ambush earlier in the week to strike at the French army. They had not heard from them since, leading many to believe that they had been wiped out to the last man. Morale was low, especially as supplies dwindled, but they still had some semblance of hope. As long as the winter faded and spring came, they could renew their offensive and perhaps even gain new recruits. So long as the French didn't find them here, then there was a chance to fight again and expel the foreigners from China once and for all. They had no idea that at the base of the mountain, far enough away to not be affected by what was to come, the French army had gathered. The French soldiers were just as bundled up as their Chinese counterparts, albeit with the latest in cold weather military uniforms. They themselves shivered as they tried to get the artillery loaded. As for Bruno, he was dressed rather lightly, all things considered. Whether it was his past life, or his current one, he handled the cold better than most. If he was born in America, he would have been that stereotypical white boy who wears a tank top and shorts in freezing weather. So long as it didn't dip into the -Fahrenheit, he had no need for clothing that covered his entire body. Still, the temperatures had dipped below the negative, and because of this he wore a coat over his tunic. But that was the extent of his extra garb. Bruno did not wear a scarf to protect his neck and face from the elements, nor did he even feel the need to wear gloves. Instead, he kept himself warm with a healthy dose of nicotine. As he gazed upon the preparations the French were making, General Frey, however, was fully bundled up as he inquired about whether or not Bruno was actually a human being. "I'm curious, does the cold not affect you? I have known a few men in my time who were rather resilient to the winter elements, but you appear to be something akin to a mythical creature. Are you even human at this point?" The temperature was currently -20°C. Which as far as Bruno was concerned was tolerable so long as he wore a jacket and full pants. And because of this, he rather boorishly responded to the French general as if he could not be damned to care about the current blizzard. "If it dips below -23, I may deem it necessary to wear a pair of gloves. Can we please focus on the assault? Oh, it looks like they're ready. Care to give the signal?" General Frey's attention instantly snapped back to the matter at hand. The artillery had been deployed and was ready to fire. They were simply waiting for orders to do so. Because of this, General Frey was quick to give it, wanting to return home to Paris and get out of this war once and for all. "Open fire." With the echo of half a dozen guns, and the sound of their shells exploding on the mountainside, Bruno watched and waited for the end of the Boxers who were holed up in the mountains, and like a frightening force of nature, it came moments later, as the snow packed on the mountain's side came crashing down upon the rebels, burying them under several dozen feet of snow, of which their bodies would never be recovered. And just like what happened here, so too did this occur at the other strongholds, which were the last of the Boxers in French-occupied territory. Bruno had fulfilled his promise. Before the winter faded, and the leaves bloomed from the trees, the Boxers had been defeated. Now all that was left was to wait for the order to return home. Chapter 20, A Peaceful Spring. Chapter 20, A Peaceful Spring. It was not long after coordinating 3 avalanches on as many Boxer strongholds that Bruno was recalled back to the German area of responsibility. Throughout the winter, the other officers in his unit had primarily spent the time within the safety, warmth, and comfort of the base. Bruno, however, was in the field, orchestrating the deaths of thousands of rebels. He had gained a reputation in this conflict, a man who was brutally efficient in finding and eliminating the enemy. With only a single engagement, he could sniff out where the others were hiding, and once he got their scent, it was all over. Because of this, the French soldiers who had served under his advisory capacity gave him a nickname that rapidly spread among the members of the Eight-Nation Alliance, one that he only became aware of when he returned to base, and was greeted by his battalion commander, Le Loup de Prusse, or in English the Wolf of Prussia. The war had lasted less than a year. By the time the German soldiers of the East Asia Expeditionary Corps had arrived in China, it was already the fall. And now, with winter nearing its end, and the objectives completed, the Kaiser issued the order to disband the primary volunteer force and return its soldiers to the fatherland. In addition to this, the Kaiser issued the minting of a commemorative medal to be given out to all the German men who participated in the war effort, which Bruno, along with the men beneath his command, would be awarded upon returning home. It was another 40 days before the German vessels docked in Hamburg, after which it was a short train ride back to Berlin where his wife awaited him. Bruno had been effectively transferred to a local infantry unit within the area but was once more given a short break before having to report to his new post. The moment the man entered his home dressed in his military uniform and with his first medal pinned to his chest, he was greeted by his young wife, who ran up to him and hugged him, thanking God that he returned home safely as she did so. "You're back. You're really back. Are you hurt anywhere? Please let me check." "Oh, thank the Lord God Almighty for sending his angels to watch over and protect you while you were gone. Are you hungry? I received word in advance that you were on your way home, and went out of my way to cook a proper meal for you. Come, let me take your coat." Heidi was so excited to see Bruno home safe and sound that she was behaving rather erratically. Bruno of course had his attention immediately drawn not to what she was saying, but the size of her belly. From the time Bruno had marched off to war, and the time he had come home, nearly 8 months had passed in total. The woman was nearing the ending stages of her pregnancy, and as the father of her child, Bruno was not even aware of this fact the entire duration. Because of this, he was quick to usher the woman to a seat, despite the fact that he was physically exhausted from a long journey home after a relatively brief but stressful war. "Heidi, you're pregnant. Why didn't you tell me in any of your letters? Come, sit down. You shouldn't be moving around so much for my sake." The young woman was happy that even after going off to war, her husband cared so much about her health that he was quick to forsake any of his own comfort to ensure that she was well looked after. And after having the woman sit down at the table, Bruno himself served the food. While they discussed well into the night what had happened in the last 8 months between the two of them, not wanting Heidi to worry about him any more than she already had, Bruno neglected to mention key details, like the various skirmishes he was a part of, or the conspiracy to assassinate him by his fellow officers, or the fact that he had been temporarily imprisoned for his actions against the Russians. He had no idea that Heidi knew about these things all along. Instead, he was more interested in talking about what had been going on in her life, rather than what he had experienced in China. And after a lengthy discussion, the two of them retired for the night. For the first time in a very long time, Bruno felt at ease as he drifted into unconsciousness, gaining the best night's sleep he had since he first left Berlin all those months ago. The following morning, Bruno found himself with a letter in the mail. It was addressed to him by the lieutenant colonel who was in charge of his battalion while he served in the East Asia Expeditionary Corps. The letter was informing him that he had personally sent a letter of recommendation to the General Staff, more specifically the Central Division of the German High Command, This letter glorified Bruno's achievements in the field and his capabilities as a leader. It also recommended that the General Staff grant an exception to him, insofar that he should not be held to the minimum requirement of being an active duty officer in the army for 5 whole years before he could apply to attend the Prussian War College. And while the results of this recommendation were unknown for the time being, Bruno was honestly happy that the lieutenant colonel had lived up to his promise. For the meantime, Bruno intended to worry about such matters after his leave of absence ended. As of this moment, he was more concerned about cooking a lovely breakfast for his pregnant wife, and seeing through the birth of their first child, which he sincerely hoped was a son. Bruno would continue to have a peaceful 2 weeks, before reporting to his unit at the end of it, where he would find that the life of a soldier in the fatherland would have much higher expectations than life as an expeditionary soldier sent abroad.